Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the survival horror modern classic, The Evil Within, and the potential and problems of adapting it as a licensed chapter. Regardless of whether or not you think Dead by Daylight is a horror game, what can't be disputed is that it's a game that loves horror, made by developers that love horror. When the Silent Hill and later Resident Evil chapters arrived in the game, it was clear that Behavior's love for the survival horror genre of games was poured into them with a laser focus on adapting the atmosphere of their respective franchises, especially with regards to visuals and sound design. And I'd like to talk today about another game that really loves the classics of survival horror, The Evil Within. Released in 2014 as the debut title of Japanese developers Tango Gameworks, The Evil Within was an unexpected success story, selling over 180,000 copies worldwide. After 3 DLCs, it would go on to receive a sequel in 2017. The Evil Within sold itself on the surreal environments and creatures that its lead character, Detective Sebastian Castellanos, must fight through to escape the horrors of STEM, the Matrix-like virtual reality that twists to reflect the psyche of its inhabitants and is infested with monsters born from the darkest reflections of the human condition. If anyone's played Silent Hill around here, language like this will sound very familiar, because The Evil Within is basically what you'd get if the original Silent Hill and Resident Evil 4 made sweet, sweet love. The Evil Within marries the over-the-shoulder shooter style of the Resident Evil games with the psychological themes and ideas of the Silent Hill games, a partnership that the sequel expanded on with open world elements and a more distinct visual style to differentiate it from its inspirations. It's a true modern classic, a phenomenon of the 21st century horror, and that's more than enough to at least consider it for a future chapter in Dead by Daylight. But does it hold up to closer inspection? And if so, who should the characters in that chapter be? This isn't a prediction, this isn't speculation, I'm doing what I do best, analysis from an artistic and creative standpoint. So let's get started by talking about what The Evil Within as a franchise could bring to the table in Dead by Daylight. The Evil Within follows the adventures of Detective Sebastian Castellanos of the Crimson City Police Department. The games cover his experiences with STEM, a device designed to create a network of human minds tied together to make a virtual reality collectively shaped by the psyches of its inhabitants. Each STEM world is built around an individual wired into it known as the Core, and the 2 Evil Within games explore the notion of who can be the Core and what the consequences of that are. The first game has STEM's creator, the unstable neuroscientist and serial killer Ruben Victoriano aka Ruvik, as the Core, and Sebastian has to delve deep into Ruvik's psychological landscape to escape from the hell created from and haunted by Ruvik's inner demons. This creates a Silent Hill-esque atmosphere for the first game, where Ruvik's damaged mind creates a horrifying, grotesque environment full of twisted horrors and architecture that does not abide by reality's laws. Aspects of Ruvik's psyche manifest as the monsters Sebastian fights throughout the game's events, such as the spider-like Laura, the hulking Amalgam Alpha, and the safe-headed juggernaut known as the Keeper, who serves as the unofficial mascot of the first game. The second game takes the concept of the first and runs with it in a very different way. The near-omnipotent Core isn't the antagonist this time round, but the plot device that the characters fight over in the form of Sebastian's daughter, Lily. Despite her incredible power, Lily doesn't have the untouchably massive ego needed to properly use that power, while sustaining the SimCity of Union. So control over her, and therefore of Union, is the main point of contention for the story and its characters. Sebastian's mission of survival in the first game becomes a quest to rescue his daughter in the second. But most of the game's content and overall tone stays consistent between the 2 games. Both follow a Resident Evil style third-person camera angle, although the second game does have a first-person mode, with a mixture of enemies to kill and puzzles to solve as you progress through the world. The Evil Within 2 starts to delve into open-world exploration elements as well that the first game didn't have, but beyond that the gameplay doesn't really change a lot between installments. It's got the trippy psychological horror and surreal character designs of Silent Hill, and the gameplay patterns and the camera angle of a classic Resident Evil title. So its 2 biggest inspirations happen to be possibly the best received licensed DLC of all time, and without a doubt the most popular licensed DLC of all time. You know what? That's a pretty good opening argument for the Evil Within's arrival into the game. The biggest argument I can think of against the Evil Within's inclusion is how the game is still relatively new and small, especially when compared to the size of the other licenses. Resident Evil and Silent Hill are both venerable old giants of the horror landscape, as are all our cinematic slashers from ages past, with the most obscure probably being Pinhead or Sadako, whose movies are mostly enjoyed by horror enthusiasts like myself. But even then, if you show a member of the public a picture of Pinhead or Sadako, they'll at least recognise the image from somewhere. Maybe they remember their releases from their youth, or grew up with a peripheral knowledge of the character, even if they'd never seen the movies. The Evil Within doesn't have that instant recognisability, in large part because it's still a very young franchise. The first game came out in 2014, only 2 years before DBD itself, which would make it the second youngest license behind Stranger Things. For a licensed chapter to be arguably less well known than DBD itself would certainly be a first for the game, but perhaps not one behaviour would be particularly keen for from a business perspective. But it isn't like The Evil Within is a tiny indie game either. The first game still sold 180,000 copies, which doesn't seem like a lot compared to DBD's 5 million, but it's still a very lucrative and well-regarded horror franchise. That's another thing. The Evil Within has a spotless track record of consistent high quality, and games in the series are still being actively produced. Admittedly, I'm not sure if you can really count 2 games out of 2 consistent, but you get what I'm trying to say here, right? The other 2 horror games we've had chapters for, Resident Evil and Silent Hill, have both had troubled histories, shall we say, with the quality of Resident Evil games being usually a bit of a coin flip, and Silent Hill not having made a good game in 10 years. Or a bad one for that matter. Any game at all, really. It is, for all intents and purposes, a dead franchise, getting by on brand recognition and fond memories from its fans, while Konami pisses away its own IP on pachinko machines and overpriced merch. The Evil Within is very much alive and well, and Tango Gameworks seem keen to continue to grow the franchise. The Evil Within 3 was a project that Tango had on their plate for a little while, indicating that a sequel is planned, but they turned some of the groundwork they'd done for it into a new original IP, Ghostwire Tokyo, that released just a few weeks ago. Now that Ghostwire is out, there's a very real chance the majority of Tango's hands on deck are back on The Evil Within 3, their first and most bankable franchise. A Dead by Daylight chapter could be part of that brand expansion, and we'd be able to see future cosmetics in the game based on characters in later installments of the franchise. 3 years ago, I'd have said Evil Within coming to Dead by Daylight was pretty unlikely, but since then we've had a ton of big licenses crossed off the list. Hellraiser, Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Stranger Things, Ringu, and the list of remaining viable licenses is dwindling pretty fast. They could definitely do a lot worse than getting a maintained and well-regarded name in survival horror, arguably the most well-regarded they haven't already got, in for a chapter. If nothing else, to keep the rabbit from the door. And atmospherically it would be a home run. The Evil Within takes a lot aesthetically from Silent Hill, one of the most visually gorgeous chapters they've ever made, so it's kind of a no-brainer really. The first game is very heavy on the rusty metal and grimy industrial settings covered in flesh growing from the walls, and while the second game doesn't have that filth encrusting every surface, it makes up for it with an eerily empty suburban sprawl that uses places we're familiar with like a hotel or a theatre as tools to unsettle us, while keeping the disturbing and twisted enemy designs.
I'm gonna do the subterfuge thing. Stand behind the car, throw the bottle into the road.
Okay, she just tanked the crossbow bolt. Okay, fair. Okay, bye. She just like, nope. I tasted crossbow. Oh, she's come back. But enough pontification. Let's talk business. Who'd be the candidates that would be best suited to Dead by Daylight? Let's start with the obvious. If you think there's a universe in which Sebastian Castellanos would not be the survivor in Evil Within chapter, I'm afraid I have some magic beans to sell you. He's the main character of both games, and despite the fact that he's not terribly well characterised in the first game, there's lots of groundwork laid for the second game to expand on Sebastian's character in interesting ways, which it does follow through with. He's kind of sidelined throughout most of the first game, because the game isn't really about him, it's about Ruvik, the world he created in STEM, and the psychological state that led him to create it. Sebastian's just kind of along for the ride. He fulfills his purpose as a vessel for the player to save the day, and is mostly characterised through his interactions with his colleagues, Joseph Oda and Julie Kidman. Kidman has a much bigger role than Joseph, and unlike him appears in the sequel, but they're both good characters on their own, and would make ideal legendary skins for Evil Within fans. Kidman could be her own survivor alternatively, and while I don't think they would necessarily do that for someone who's ultimately still a side character, having her be the more action-focused of the duo while Sebastian's perks revolve around his psychological stability and quick thinking skills he's played in STEM would be a really sweet dynamic. In the first game, Sebastian squares off against the horrors that lurk in Ruvik's madness, and this is where I like to start talking about killers, because the Evil Within has a ton of good options for the role. The obvious answer, at least from the first game, would be the big baddie Ruvik himself, which would make him Dead by Daylight's second burn victim in reality warping powers, stuck in an immaterial dimension and voiced by Jackie L. Haley. But there's a pretty substantial set of issues associated with making Ruvik the killer, not least of which the fact that his power set is both extremely poorly defined and utterly fucking busted in half. Psychopaths with an untouchable ego, unconcerned by the difficulties of others, are already more powerful than the ordinary person in STEM, and Ruvik building himself into the core of the Beacon Mental Hospital STEM machine cranked that power up to 11. Let's get a perspective on how powerful Ruvik is. If you run into him during one of the few times you cross paths before the end of the game, he touches you and kills you instantly with his mind. Yeah, you just fucking die because Ruvik is that powerful. It takes you thoroughly dismantling his defences and killing all the monsters that were made from his psychological state to even start to threaten him. And at the end of the game, you don't even kill him. It's strongly implied that Ruvik's plan to hijack the body of one of the hospital patients, Leslie, succeeded, and Ruvik escaped STEM to continue his work. Designing a powerful Ruvik that would be both fair and fitting to his character would be basically impossible. He is a literal deus ex machina, the god in the machine, and trying to bring him down to the mundanity needed to be a killer just wouldn't work. So then I think it's time to look at his henchmen. There's three I think deserve proper attention, and they're the three Tango clearly holds in highest regard, to the point that they brought them back briefly in the sequel. Reborn Laura, the spider-like reincarnation of Ruvik's dead sister. The Sadist, the manifestation of Ruvik's, sadism. And the Keeper, the personification of Ruvik's secretive nature as it bears the safe in which he stored his research. I'm going to cut to the chase here because the Keeper is the obvious pick here, let's be totally honest. The Sadist is such a nothing burger that's mostly just there as a starter boss to ease you into the start of the first game by giving you a recurring manageable mini-boss. Plus we've already got two Chainsaw Boys. And Laura, despite being a boss I always loved fighting, with a great visual and sound design and probably the most poignant and meaningful connection to Ruvik, just doesn't have the sticking power that the Keeper does in terms of being a unique and memorable presence. She crawls fast, climbs out of dead bodies, and really doesn't like fire. There's not really a lot to her to flesh her power out. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't hate Laura at all, I just think she's a little lackluster compared to, the safe option. The Keeper is very, very close to what we'd expect a killer in Dead by Daylight to look like, and do right out of the gate. His power set is very clearly established. In addition to his raw bulk and the oversized meat tenderizer he uses as a weapon, the Keeper places barbed wire traps on the floor to snare wandering victims so he may deal with them at his pleasure. His safe head also presents a potentially lethal threat, since he can tear off his own head to regrow his body out of any other safe he can find, meaning that he can traverse solid objects and long distances without concern, so long as he has a safe to reform to. That's pretty much a clean-cut killer power set right there in front of us. A trap killer who can traverse the map by teleporting to safes across long distances. I know trap killers aren't terribly popular, and there might be wine or DBD history we've only ever had like 2.5 of them. 2 3/4 if we're counting PTB artist. But that's all the more reason we're overdue one that actually has the means to move across the map and set up new control zones once the old ones get picked apart or set up somewhere else to adapt to the survivors' movements. I'll be totally honest, if we got the Keeper and Sebastian, I'd be a very happy little gamer over here. I only played the Evil Within games pretty recently, but it didn't take me long to be utterly enchanted with them, and I know I'm not the only one. Several of the stills in this video were rendered by Cam, a lovely human and Evil Within enthusiast who was pretty active in the DBD modding community back when that actually existed. They weren't rendered for this video, Cam's been an Evil Within fan way longer than I've been aware of it. We thought it would just be good to show them here for effect, and Cam's Twitter can be found in the description, so do go show him some love if you like what you're seeing. Well, I guess that settles it. Base the chapter off of the first game, Sebastian as the survivor, Keeper as the killer, and Beacon Mental Hospital as the map. Bish bash bosh, chapter done. GG easy. Unless... What if instead of doing that, they just didn't? Keep Sebastian as the survivor, obviously. He's our leading man. But he shouldn't look like this. He should look like this. His Evil Within 2 design. But as much as I do like the 1920s detective vibe he gives off the original game, I think it exemplifies everything generic about Sebastian that held his character back in the original game, and it's a symptom of a wider problem I had with Evil Within 1 artistically. The original Evil Within loved Silent Hill and Resident Evil so much that sometimes it forgets to be its own thing. It feels like I've said these names a dozen times by now, but that's because you can't really talk about the Evil Within's art without understanding that if Evil Within has any one flaw, it's too derivative from these sources. The Keeper is the perfect statement here. Giant weird metal head, oversized kitchen utensil, a reflection of dark violence and repressed secrets. Like, we already have one Pyramid Head in DBD, we don't need another one. And all that meat architecture too, it's nothing we haven't seen before in third-person survival horror. The Evil Within is a great game, obsessed with mimicking other great games, and retreating into genre cliches and egregious shots of Kidman's ass when it can't use those great predecessors as source material. The second game though, that's when things start to get a little more interesting. From as early as the first cutscene, Sebastian's introduced as a very different character from the tough-talking man of action we see in the original game. It's represented as out-of-character behaviour for Sebastian. It's clear the events of the first game changed him. He left the police department and spent 3 years trying to hunt down the people who created STEM, the mysterious Mobius, who had employed his own junior detective Kidman behind his back during the Beacon incident. Sebastian's sanity was slowly slipping away from him. He drank heavily as he obsessed over what had transpired at Beacon. The overall arc of the second game is his redemption from his failure to stop Ruvik and uncover the truth in the first, and this massively enriches Sebastian's character in Evil Within 2. He manages to step beyond the cliché detective's clothes and no-nonsense attitude and allows his vulnerabilities to be his driving force, and says something to bury. And he moves from being a vessel for players to move through the world to the emotional heart of the whole franchise. And just like how Sebastian is far more his own man in the Evil Within 2 than he is in the original game, the sequel's characters and overall horror vibe are much more its own, compared to the compelling but ultimately derivative style of the first game. An Evil Within chapter should celebrate what's unique about the Evil Within, not the franchises and games that inspired it. And since the monster that directly inspired the Keeper is already in Dead by Daylight, it's not exactly something players are likely to miss. It's not to say I think the Keeper should be ignored, I think he'd be an excellent and widely popular legendary cosmetic for the Trapper. Instead, I suggest a killer from the more experimental second game, one who immediately gripped the attention of players, provided a new sadistic face of evil for the sequel, and whose only crime was that he was gone too soon. I give you Stefano Valentini. Stefano is the overarching villain of the first half of the Evil Within 2, as he abducts Lily Castellanos and Sebastian is forced to fight through his nightmarish creations to save her. Due to his ego and psychopathy being amplified in STEM, he's gifted with superhuman powers in Union, not on the level of Ruvik, but definitely way beyond the normal person. His camera veritas freezes anyone it gets a photo of in time, allowing Stefano to indulge in his sadistic art by torturing or killing his victims and photographing their last moments to preserve them in STEM forever. As an artist first and foremost, he's all about capturing that perfect moment as life leaves one's body, and Veritas lets him do that in a very literal sense. To help him, he also constructs minions similar to Ruvik's to provide a bit of muscle and as a piece of artistic expression. The three Sebastian runs into most often are the Guardian, a colossus made of the bodies of women Stefano murdered, the Aperture, the giant eye that watches Union on Stefano's behalf, and the Obscura, a living tripod and Stefano's favourite and most iconic creation. Stefano is Evil Within 2's most interesting new character, because he's one of the only genuinely proactive characters besides Sebastian. He's less powerful than Ruvik or the other main antagonists of the second game, but he makes up for it by actually doing things and using the power he does have to try and make plays for more. He starts out as the operative of Father Theodore, the other psychopath living in Union, to take the core Lily and deliver her to him. But when he realises Theodore is manipulating him, he decides to use her power for his own ends, and that puts him in Sebastian's way as he seeks to get his daughter back. Most of Evil Within 2's successful horror elements come from him, with the harrowing artworks he created being on display long before Sebastian actually meets him. And the hotel we first encounter him in reflects his delusions of refinement and taste. It's very different from the landscape of Ruvik's more openly deranged mind, as Stefano genuinely believes he's some enlightened genius without even acknowledging that the people he's hurting are anything more than tools to be used. If Ruvik and the stem of the first game showcase what inspired the Evil Within, Stefano highlights what Evil Within is at its best and most original. A human villain who puts the psychology in psychological horror, and refuses to give any excuses for the monster he has become, in favour of exploring the consequences of a totally all-consuming ego. Don't get me wrong, I still love the Keeper, I really truly do. I'd love to see him in DBD. He'd still likely be the pick for the killer in the event of an Evil Within chapter, and if we got him, he'd be a solid 9 out of 10 for me. But Stefano's an 11. And it's not even like the Keeper couldn't be in DBD if Stefano was the killer. He'd be an ideal legendary skin for the Trapper, like I said. A new model and sounds, a custom more like the only skin in DBD Mobile, would be able to have representation from both games in the series, taking their well-deserved places in the fog. Due to his unique method of killing with the Veritas camera, making Stefano a legendary skin for someone like, say, Trickster, would be much harder than making the Keeper a skin. So I decided to do a little power concept for Stefano like I did for Candyman. There's 3 things I think that should be reflected in Stefano's potential power. The Veritas camera's ability to mess with time, his ability to teleport in a camera flash, and the creations he builds to provide some brawn for his brains. So with that in mind, let's get started with my power concept for Stefano Valentini, the photographer. Stefano would be a tall 115 speed killer with a standard terror radius, and his power, Suffer from My Art, would have 2 parts. The main power Veritas and the secondary power Obscura. Veritas is Stefano's camera and would be his primary chase tool. Since freezing survivors in time might be a little irritating to deal with, the basic idea would need to be toned down a bit, but it could definitely work as a power. Using the power button, Stefano would raise his camera, slowing himself down and looking through his camera's viewfinder, restricting his field of view to only what the killer player could see on the camera. While the camera flash charged, Survivor would be able to hear the whine of a flashbulb charging, like you get on old cameras. That would be the audio equivalent of Huntress raising a hatchet in a way, the sign the attack is coming. Taking a picture would photograph all survivors in the camera's view when the picture is taken, afflicting them with a brief but heavy hindered effect to allow Stefano to catch up to the survivor and maybe get the hit with his primary weapon, his knife. Throughout the game this would also fill the Obscura meter at the bottom. Taking a photo of a survivor would give you a chunk of progress. Hitting a survivor affected by the slow would give you another chunk. Once the meter is full, Stefano would be able to summon the Obscura for a brief time, an AI-controlled buddy who would help out for a bit before being dismissed. Yeah, I know what you're gonna say, AI in DBD sucks, and we all know how much I hate Nemesis zombies, but hear me out. My problem with Nemesis zombies aren't that they're AI inherently, it's that they're everything a power element should not be. They're completely passive, with nothing that Nemesis can do to make them more reliable. They rely on certain items to interact with them, they offer no potential to outplay the survivor skillfully, they are buggy as shit, often requiring the killer to go and unstick them from whichever bush, generator or low box that they're dry humping, and rely on RNG to give you any value at all. If you can make AI elements that aren't passive but earned, have clearly defined moments of power and weakness that both sides can play around regardless of needing to bring in items, provide skillful interactions for the killer to outplay the survivors, and have easy ways to resolve any environmental complications caused by the AI, I think AI elements in a power can work. so when designing the Obscura I plan to try and hit all these criteria. So your meter is charged up and you'll want to summon the Obscura. If you press the button, it'll spawn the Obscura relatively near, say within 24 meters, of the furthest survivor from Stefano. It will then start to move towards the nearest survivor it can detect unless the attention is drawn by something else, such as a chase, a drop pallet, or a generator being worked on, dismissing itself after 2 minutes. The Obscura will be unable to directly harm survivors, but is instead equipped with a camera identical to Stefano's own, with the same wind-up time and hindered effect. Any survivors photographed by the Obscura will have their killer instinct revealed to Stefano. The button used to summon the Obscura can be used by Stefano to teleport and switch places with it, putting the teleport on a long cooldown. This serves a couple of functions. It gives Stefano some map mobility so that if the Obscura marks someone, Stefano can instantly head over and follow up, but it also provides a quality of life function in game, in case the Obscura gets stuck in the middle of nowhere or an object, since the teleport will move it to wherever Stefano is. The Obscura cannot be killed by the survivors like the zombies can, but can be hindered in a couple of ways. If the survivor performs a rushed exit from a locker in front of the Obscura, it will be stunned like a base kit head-on, and it can also be stunned by a pallet but not blinded by a flashlight. The Obscura can also break pallets, which is useful since Stefano wouldn't have a base kit pallet break, and it lets it move past pallets that have stunned it. In chase, the Obscura will be drawn to running survivors, but will maintain a little bit of distance. Remember, since it can't attack the survivors directly, it has no reason to get close to them, so it'll hang around like a real photographer trying to get the perfect angle for the right shot. Since photos it takes will provide the same hindered effect as Stefano's own, it'll provide some chase lethality if Stefano is paying attention and the survivor doesn't avoid the snapshot. But because it has the same wind-up time and flashbulb sound, there will still be telegraphing to allow the survivor to play around it. Not like the zombies where you don't see them so they just hit you instantly. And to reward Stefano players for good timing and playing around the Obscura effectively, I had a little thought for a bonus. If Stefano and the Obscura coordinate their photographs perfectly and take a photo of the same survivor at the same time, they're frozen in place instead of hindered for the duration of the effect. This wouldn't happen very much, obviously, because it would require a lot of things to go right, and good timing on the killer's part, but it would be a nice Easter egg for enjoyers of the game to be able to entrap the survivors just like he did in Evil Within 2. So that's everything I had to say about Stefano Valentini and Evil Within as a whole in Dead by Daylight. I'd love to see it, but I'd also love to know what you think. So let me know in the comments, is my power concept something fundamentally wrong? Do you think there's ways I could add to it, or a new killer altogether that you'd suggest? Okay, well, hello everyone, thank you for watching that video. I want to give you a quick update on the state of things right now and why I didn't upload in about a week and a half. And yeah, shit's been kind of crazy lately because I've just moved, as you can tell by the new environs. That meant I had no broadband connection until like Saturday. And I had food poisoning towards the end of last week. And on Sunday my YouTube account got hacked and all my videos got hidden. My channel name ID got changed. That's all been sorted now, so thank God. I needed the dub right now because it's all kind of gone to shit. But now everything's sorted, I'm in my new place. I have some exciting news. Because I've moved, this means I should be able to get back to streaming on a fairly regular basis going forward, because the main reason I couldn't stream was because of where I was living. But now that's no longer an issue. So when I get a new overlay sorted and start to get the stream looking a bit more professional, I'll be streaming once more and there'll be an update on the channel to let you know when that's going to be. But that's not all, because what's recently been leaked is Hattie Core, a character from the lore a while ago, is coming in as the 6th anniversary survivor, and the Observer's gone missing too. So I've got a hell of a lot of work on my plate over the next few weeks and months. To make sure you don't miss it, I'd recommend liking and subscribing if you're interested in seeing more of what's coming. And in the description you can find links to my Twitter, my Twitch, which I'm going to be using a lot more now, my Discord, my Patreon and my Ko-fi in case you're interested in supporting the channel, and links to my merch store are down there as well. So, I'll see you for the next one. Ta-ta for now.